Okay, thanks everyone for coming along today, and I would like to take you through an overview of advanced quant techniques today. So when thinking about preparing a presentation on advanced quant techniques, it really raises the question of what advanced techniques are market researchers using, and even what quant techniques in general are people using. So to answer these questions, we decided, in the spirit of the wisdom of crowds, to ask our crowd what quant techniques they used. Now, this was done via an online quantitative questionnaire that asked people which quant techniques they used from a fairly comprehensive list of both traditional and contemporary MR approaches, and how frequently they used each of these. So, before we discuss the results, I'll briefly give you an overview of who's in the crowd and how they came to take part in the survey. So, in terms of who our crowd is, it's very important to note that this is a non-representative sample, so these results are not generalizable. It's very much a convenient sample, with participants being drawn from various networks that we have, NewMR.org itself, various Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups, etc. The data collection is still ongoing, so we may see the results change a little from the picture today, but we've got 207 completes to date. So predominantly the sample is made up of researchers, people who say that they sell, design or supply research, and they make up approximately 80% of the sample that we're looking at. The crowd is very much a global crowd. The dominant countries in the sample were the USA, the UK, Australia and Canada. However, there are 28 additional countries represented, including people from India, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and a really diverse range of countries. So, what did the crowd say? Well, if we look at the results in terms of researchers who are wanting to get more involved with quant research and to see how their skills and experience compare to other researchers, we see that the must-know technique for quant researchers is, perhaps not surprisingly, crosstabs, with 78% of our sample using it at least monthly and another 13% using it at least quarterly. Now, the must-have software is Excel, with about 92% of people saying they use it at least monthly. So crosstabs and Excel are your entry-level techniques and software. For those people wanting to move beyond crosstabs, the next set of techniques to make sure you have under your belt are weightings, t-tests and correlations, with about 2/3 of our sample using these at least quarterly. And moving even further along, the next level of techniques seem to be factor analysis, chi-squared, linear and multilinear regression, and also text mining and analytics, with around half using these at least quarterly. And then even further along are the techniques of cluster analysis, ANOVA, perceptual mapping and NPS, with around 1/4 of people using these at least quarterly. We also wanted to look at techniques which seem to go together, so we've also conducted a factor analysis of the data. And this analysis gave us factors that relate to the very traditional MR approaches, a factor that is really about NPS and highlights that it's really a standalone factor, and two newer approaches, which we'll look at in a bit more detail shortly. So one of the first factors we came across is one that we can really call the Stats Toolkit, and that brings together techniques like correlation, linear and multilinear regression, logistic regression, factor analysis, multidimensional scaling, ANOVA and MANOVA, and also the traditional stats tests of TZ and F tests, and also convex alpha. Another very clear factor relates to choice methods. It pulls together the techniques of latent class, conjoint analysis, discrete choice, max diff, HB. TERF is a little different, but we can see how it fits in there. Another clear technique relates to models. It includes things like linear and multilinear regression, structural equation modelling, and we'll have a quite detailed introduction from Scott McLean later on structural equation modelling, and he will explore a bit further how in SEM we can take an existing model and use a combination of factor and regression analysis to link the data you collect to a theoretical model, or what we would call latent variables. Also in this factor there's things like PLS, path analysis and logistic regression. Another factor that emerged we can perhaps call segmentation. If we take out the tools that you might use to prepare or explore your data, such as crosstabs and weighting, what remains are some of the classic data reduction techniques and the techniques that we use for segmenting data. Things like cluster analysis, correspondence analysis, factor analysis, and also decision trees, things like Chade and Cart. We also had a very clear pricing factor that brings together things like brand price trade-off, which Ray Pointer will present in much more detail later, and also Gabor Granger and Van Westendorp price sensitivity modelling. Now, moving on to what we were referring to as the factors that talk about the techniques that are not really traditional MR approaches, we see one that brings together some of the newer and perhaps buzzwords in the area, things like agent-based modelling, predictive markets, and genetic algorithms, and text mining and analytics. But within that, we see some techniques that have been around for a long time, things like Kaplan-Meier and survival analysis, and these seem to be harnessed in new ways with some of these newer approaches. We also came across a factor that is not traditional MR and very much looks at market modelling, things like media mix and market mix modelling, and they also seem to be drawing on some of the more traditional techniques that come out of the econometrics field. We also wanted to look at what techniques researchers are using and if we could put some rough sizes onto different clusters of people. So to do this, we've run a k-means cluster analysis, and we'll present today what was a 4-cluster solution. So we do have one cluster that we can perhaps call people who are advanced quant researchers. That group's about 16% of our sample, so not necessarily 16% of market researchers. And we can see these are people who are very frequently using things like crosstabs, weighting, multilinear regression, factor analysis, and Z and T tests. They're also using quite a diverse range of other techniques, things like F-tests, chi-squared, ANOVA, decision trees, conjoint and choice modelling techniques, max diff, MNL, logistic regression, discriminant and correspondence analysis, perceptual maps, multidimensional scaling, and text analytics, so really quite a wide range there. We then move on to a second cluster who are traditionalists in what they use, but with a skew towards the academic use of statistics. And indeed, if we look at the profile of this cluster, around 2/3 of our the academics from our sample do fall into this group. So these people are basically using crosstabs and statistical tests. So we see them using things like Z, T, and F tests, chi-squared, ANOVA, and also regression and weighting. So very much a strong academic focus on the sort of research that they're doing. Then we have a third factor, which at the moment is around 17%, and we're considering this really to be a cluster of market researchers. They're people whose most common techniques are crosstabs and weighting, very much the bread and butter of market research, And they're also using common segmentation and modeling techniques, things like cluster analysis, factor analysis, perceptual mapping, conjoint and choice, max diff, regression, and other pricing techniques. And then we have what is our largest cluster in this, a group of around 39%, and they're really less frequent crosstabers. They're people who the main quant technique they use is crosstabs, and even then they don't use it quite as frequently as any of the other three clusters. So that's really a picture of how our sample falls out at the moment. It might give you a little idea of where you sit within the market research field. We also asked people what software they used, and as we alluded to earlier, Excel is certainly the dominant software used by our sample at the moment. We also have a lot of people using SPSS, with around 61% of people using it monthly, and another 12% using it quarterly. And more for interest, we've just shown here the percentages of people using SAS, and as you can see, they're fairly small percentages, but we do have 8% of people using it monthly and 5% quarterly. And another software package called R has been getting quite a bit of press recently, and you can see that it's got 7% of people using it monthly and 7% seeing it quarterly. And I don't think we would be surprised if we ran this survey in 12 months or 2 years to see if perhaps that percentage might grow quite a bit. So the other thing we're interested in is we know what techniques people are using now, and we know what techniques people have been using in the past. But we're wondering if we could start to get a feel for what is the next big thing. What's the technique out there if you're perhaps looking at building your skill set over the next 12 months, 2 years, that you should start to get a feel for, start to get some experience with. So we asked people what they thought was the next big thing. And we really got a very diverse response. As you can see from this Wordle here of the verbatims that people typed in, a really diverse range of techniques. If we look into those vast array of techniques and start to code things and get a picture of were there a number of dominant techniques that were coming through, the two key themes to draw out of it were that a number of people are saying text analytics is the next big thing, but still only around 15% of people, so it's not an overwhelming next big thing, but it's certainly one of the key themes that was coming out. And the second theme that was coming out was what's starting to be referred to as big data, the techniques that allow us to mine data, so things like data mining and data fusion. People are starting to talk about those, but once again, still below 15%, so not an overwhelming response from people, but they're probably the two dominant themes that were coming out of the next big thing. Very diverse range from some techniques that have been around for a long time, people still think that they might be the next big thing, and some of the newer things that people are talking about currently. So, as I was saying earlier, the data collection is still continuing. So if after today you think, I've not been invited or I've not yet had a chance to join the survey, you are certainly welcome to and even encouraged to. The link to the survey can be found on the NewMR.org Advanced Quant page, and if you go about halfway down the page, you'll see there's a heading, Survey on Advanced Quant Techniques, and there's a link that you can click to take part in the survey. So I'd like to thank everybody who has taken part in the survey so far for taking some time out of your day and enabling us to present these results today, and thank anyone in advance who takes the survey after today's presentation. So thanks very much for being here and listening to this today, and I welcome any questions that you might have.